Leukocytes. There are 5 major types of leukocytes, or white blood cells: monocytes, neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, and lymphocytes. Their collective function is to fight infections. Monocytes and neutrophils are phagocytes. They engulf and digest bacteria and debris from the body's own dead cells. Lymphocytes develop into specialized B cells and T cells, which produce the immune response against foreign substances. White blood cells usually patrol through interstitial fluid and the lymphatic system. Platelets. Platelets are fragments of cells about 2 to 3 nanometers in diameter. Platelets originate as pinched-off cytoplasmic fragments of large cells in the bone marrow. They have no nuclei and function in the important process of blood clotting. Stem cells. Pluripotent stem cells develop new erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. These stem cells are located in the red bone marrow of the bones, particularly the ribs, vertebrae, breastbone, and pelvis. These cells arise in the early embryo, and the population renews itself while replenishing the blood with cellular elements. A negative feedback system, sensitive to the amount of O2 reaching the body's tissue via the blood, controls erythrocyte production. A hormone response produced by the kidney called erythropoietin, or EPO, stimulates the production of erythrocytes. Stem cells are being researched and could potentially be the cure to many diseases, including leukemia. Blood clotting. Blood contains self-sealing material that prevents us from bleeding to death. Fibrinogen is the inactive form of the always-present sealant. A clot forms only when this plasma protein is converted into its active form, fibrin, which aggregates into threads that form the framework of the clot. More than a dozen clotting factors have been discovered, but this mechanism is still not fully understood. A genetic mutation that affects any of the steps of this process causes hemophilia, a disease characterized by excessive bleeding from even minor cuts and bruises. Anti-clotting factors prevent clotting in the absence of injury. Sometimes platelets clump and fibrin coagulates within a blood vessel. This is known as a thrombus and is more likely to form in individuals with cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular diseases are disorders of the heart and blood vessels that cause more than half of the deaths in the U.S. The tendency to develop the disease is inherited to some extent, but lifestyle plays a major role, including smoking, lack of exercise, diet rich in animal fat, and high cholesterol. One type of cholesterol particle, low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, also known as bad cholesterol, is associated with the deposition of cholesterol in arterial plaques. The other type of cholesterol particle, known as high-density lipoproteins, or HDLs, aka good cholesterol, appears to reduce the deposition of cholesterol. Healthy arteries have a smooth inner lining, but when cholesterol is deposited, it thickens and roughens the lining. A plaque forms at the site and narrows the bore of the artery, leading to atherosclerosis, a leading chronic cardiovascular disease. The rough lining seems to encourage the adhesion of platelets, triggering the clotting process and interfering with circulation. Hypertension, high blood pressure, promotes atherosclerosis and increases chances for heart attack and stroke. As the disease progresses, arteries become narrower and the threat of heart attack or stroke increases. A heart attack is the death of cardiac muscle tissue resulting from prolonged blockage of one or more coronary arteries supplying oxygen to the constantly beating heart. A stroke is the death of nervous tissue in the brain, usually resulting from the rupture or blockage of the arteries in the head. Both heart attacks and strokes result frequently from a thrombus that clogs an artery. An embolus is a clot that originates in the circulatory system and reaches the heart or brain via the bloodstream. Gas exchange. Gas exchange, though often called respiration, should not be confused with cellular respiration that creates ATP. Gas exchange is the uptake of molecular oxygen from the environment and the discharge of carbon dioxide to the environment. The source of oxygen, the respiratory medium, is air for terrestrial animals and water for most aquatic animals. The respiratory surface is the part of an animal's body where gases are exchanged with the surrounding environment. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are moved across the membrane entirely by diffusion. Respiratory surfaces tend to be thin and have large surface areas. The surface must supply oxygen and expel carbon dioxide for the entire body. In relatively simple animals, such as sponges, the plasma membrane of every cell in that body is close enough to the external environment for gases to diffuse in and out. In many animals, that isn't the case due to the bulk of body. Their respiratory surfaces are a thin, moist epithelium separating the respiratory medium from the blood or capillaries, which transport gases to and from the rest of the body. Some animals use their entire outer skin as a respiratory organ. These animals must keep their skins constantly moist and thus live in water or damp places. Gills, trachea, and lungs are the three most common respiratory organs. Gills are outfolding of the body surface that are suspended in water. It has its advantages and disadvantages. Because it is surrounded by water, it has no problem keeping the plasma membrane moist. However, oxygen concentrations in water are low, and the warmer and saltier the water, the less dissolved oxygen it can be held. Thus, gills must be very effective for an animal to obtain enough oxygen. To get all the oxygen they need, one of the processes animals use is ventilation. Ventilation is when an animal increases the flow of the respiratory medium over the respiratory surface. Because water is dense and contains little oxygen, animals with gills must use a considerable amount of energy to ventilate their gills. Another process used by animals, mainly fish, is a very efficient process called countercurrent exchange. This is when blood flows in the direction opposite to the movement of water past the gills. This makes it possible to efficiently transfer oxygen to the blood. The mechanism is so efficient that the gills can remove more than 80% of the oxygen dissolved in the water passing through the gills. The tracheal system. Air has many advantages over the water as a respiratory medium. It has a much higher concentration of oxygen in the water, and oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse much faster in air, resulting in less ventilation for respiratory surfaces exposed to air. The one problem that air poses is that a large moist respiratory surface would constantly lose water to the air by evaporation. This problem is for the most part solved by a respiratory surface folded into the body. The two terrestrial respiratory structures include the lung and the tracheal system of insects. The tracheal system is made up of air tubes that branch throughout the body. The largest of the tubes, called trachea, open to the outside. The finest branches extend to the surface of nearly every cell within the body. For smaller insects, diffusion through the trachea brings in enough oxygen and removes enough carbon dioxide to support cellular respiration. In larger insects, however, a higher energy demand causes them to ventilate the tracheal systems with rhythmic body movements that compress and expand air tubes like bellows. An insect in flight consumes 10 to 200 times more oxygen than it does at rest. To meet these high energy demands, in many insects, alternating contraction and relaxation of the flight muscles compress and expand the body, rapidly pumping air through the tracheal system. The copious amount of oxygen is then used by flight muscles packed with mitochondria that generate ATP required for flight. Lungs. Lungs are the other form of a folded internal respiratory surface. Unlike branching tracheal systems of insects, lungs are restricted to one location and do not have direct contact with all other parts of the body. This gap is bridged by the circulatory system, which transports gases between the lungs and the rest of the body. A dense net of capillaries under the epithelium forms the respiratory surface in animals that contain lungs, including spiders, terrestrial snails, and vertebrates. In general, the size and the complexity of lungs correlate with an animal's metabolic rate. Mammalian systems. In mammals, lungs are located in the thoracic, or chest, cavity, and have a spongy texture and are honeycombed with a moist epithelium that functions as the respiratory surface. Air enters through the nostrils and then is filtered by hairs, warmed, humidified, and sampled for odors as it flows through the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity leads to the pharynx, the intersection of the path for air and food. When food is swallowed, the larynx moves upward and tips the epiglottis over the glottis, the opening of the windpipe. This allows food to go down the esophagus instead of entering the lungs. The rest of the time, the glottis is open, enabling breathing. The larynx wall is reinforced with cartilage, and in most mammals, the larynx contains a pair of vocal cords that can produce sounds when voluntary muscles in the larynx or voice box are tensed, stretching the cords so they vibrate. The air then passes through the larynx into the trachea or windpipe, whose shape is maintained by the series of C-shaped rings of cartilage. The trachea forks into two bronchi, one leading to each lung. Within the lung, the bronchi branch into finer and finer tubes called bronchioles. The epithelium lining that major branches of the system of air ducts, now resemblant of an inverted tree, is covered by cilia and a thin layer of film of mucus. The mucus traps dust, pollen, and other contaminants, and the beating cilia move the mucus upwards to the pharynx where it can be swallowed. This process helps cleanse the respiratory system. At their tips, the tiniest bronchioles end as alveoli, a cluster of air sacs in which gas exchange occurs across their thin epithelia. The lungs contain millions of alveoli and have a total surface area sufficient enough to carry out gas exchange for the entire body. Oxygen in the air entering the alveoli dissolves in the moist film and rapidly diffuses across the epithelium into a web of capillaries that surrounds each alveolus. Carbon dioxide diffuses in the opposite direction, from the capillaries across the epithelium and the alveolus and into the airspace.